Welcome back to the briefing on Monocle 24 with me, Andrew Muller. As a decade and change of chaos in Iraq and Afghanistan has demonstrated, it is terrifically difficult to turn a rusted-on dictatorship into a functional democracy, even with overwhelming military force and prodigious spending. In Libya, which has rather failed to command the world's attention, it has been tougher still. Earlier today, Libya's Prime Minister Ali Zeidan was, depending on who you asked, kidnapped from or arrested at a Tripoli hotel by 7 dozen gunmen, and then held, somewhat perplexingly, at Libya's Ministry of the Interior, and then released. It appears to be revenge for Mr. Zeidan's acquiescence in Saturday's seizure of al-Qaeda suspect Anas al-Libi by American commandos, or conceivably a reenactment of a Marx Brothers film. Well, joining us now for the fun task of trying to make any sense of this is Nabila Ramdani, a Franco-Algerian journalist and Middle East specialist, and Barry Malone, who covered the fall of Gaddafi for Reuters and has himself stayed in the Hotel Corinthia from whence Mr. Zeidan was taken. Barry, I'll start with you. You've stayed at the Hotel Corinthia, as have I, incidentally, although rather longer ago than you. Are you surprised that it was this easy, apparently, for a gang to seize the Prime Minister?
Well, yeah, I stayed at the Corinthia for a couple of months during the fall of Gaddafi, and, at the time, it was a very heavily protected building. This is a five-star hotel, two gleaming marble-filled towers overlooking the Mediterranean, and it's in a pretty quiet part of town. It's removed from the road. There are a couple of security barriers you have to drive around to get close to the door. And back then it was the kind of place where government ministers lived. I believe the Prime Minister was living there, where diplomats lived, where senior officials lived, and its lobbies, cafes, and restaurants were always absolutely filled with very heavily armed men. I remember the first day that I arrived to check in, watching men pass their AK-47s through the metal detectors. And so, in a way, it is surprising. But then when you understand how powerful these militias have become, then it isn't. Apparently no shots were fired. And so I would assume that a lot of the militiamen who arrived at the hotel to detain the Prime Minister would have been very familiar with it, would have been there many times, and maybe even known the men who were protecting the front door.
Is it just the case, do you think, staying with you, Barry, that however well protected a hotel is, if, as appears to be the case, nearly 100 heavily armed men turn up, there's not an awful lot you can do to stop them?
Well, I think that's exactly the point. I mean, as I say, there is heavily armed men protecting the hotel, and the Prime Minister, obviously, like all Libyan government ministers, will have his own close protection unit, who will be men probably from the same region as him, who will be extremely loyal to him. But again, it's a hotel. I mean, there's only so much you can do to protect a hotel, and if 100 turn up in pickup trucks with anti-aircraft guns on the back of them, then there's very little that you can do to stop them.
Nabila Ramdani, I'll bring you in now. Are you surprised by this?
Well, not really. I think it's symptomatic of what the ordinary Libyans are putting up with effectively day in, day out. But the only reason why it's hitting the headlines, it's because we're dealing with the Prime Minister of Libya. Just as a couple of years ago, the murder of the U.S. ambassador also made the headlines because they represent incredibly dramatic events. But this is very much symptomatic of the state of anarchy that the country is in at the moment, and there's no doubt that this has been the case since the murder of Gaddafi. And what's very clear is that the deposing of Gaddafi was everybody's priority a few years ago, and that's precisely why British and French warplanes bombed Libya over many months. But no thought almost was given to what came next, and ironically, Gaddafi was very much perceived by Western countries as the strong man who kept all these warring factions apart and, in fact, ensured stability within a notoriously unstable country. And following the 2011 uprising, prior to the 2011 uprising, Western governments were only interested in stability at any cost, and democracy didn't really come into it. But this all changed with the revolution, of course.
Nabila, what do we know for sure about the people who took him? They apparently trade as either or both the Tripoli Revolution's Operation Room, catchy, or the Committee for Fighting Crime. Who are they?
Well, I think the only thing that is certain is that the kidnapping of the Prime Minister is linked to Americans coming into a sovereign country and also kidnapping an alleged al-Qaeda leader. Now, like it or not, Libya is awash with radical Islamists, many of whom are linked to al-Qaeda, and they absolutely object to the kidnapping of Anas al-Libi, the suspected al-Qaeda leader who was abducted by the Americans. They see him as one of their own, and this is the result. Now, a spokesman for the group who kidnapped the Prime Minister, known as the Operations Room of Libya's Revolutionary, said that the abduction of the Prime Minister came after John Kerry, the U.S. Secretary of State, said that the Libyan government was aware of the operation, kidnapping Anas al-Libi. And this really reflects the weakness of the Libyan government, which is literally held hostage by powerful militias.
And to what extent are those militias being either employed or bought off by what passes for Libya's government?
Well, it's a very complex functioning. Several militias are loosely affiliated with the Libyan government, but they're essentially armed gangs, and they work with the government. They were hired by the government to try and establish law and order, but they don't necessarily respond to the government. And in fact, as I was saying, many are affiliated to al-Qaeda. There were a lot of the men involved were placed where they were outside Libya before the revolution, but with the revolution they came back to the country to getting their roots back in Libya, and that's unfortunately how the country is run at the moment. And it has to be said that according to a Western intelligence agency, Libya now has the largest unsecured stockpile of weapons in the world, with millions of tons of arms unaccounted for since the toppling of Gaddafi.
This is all sounding a little bit Somalia at this point. How far is Libya from actually being a comprehensively failed state?
Well, I think there's an awful lot of concern in the West because of the state of the country, which, is effectively run by rival factions. There is no sense that law and order can be re-established overnight. But crucially, Western governments are concerned about Westerners becoming targets increasing of those militias. For example, there's particular concern over the fact that up to 8,000 so-called surface-to-air missiles are available in the country and easy to use by groups linked to al-Qaeda to, for example, target all types of aircraft, including civilian passenger warplanes, and that would be high in the mind of Western government, and especially those who were involved in taking sides in the uprising, effectively supporting rebel factions.
Nabila Ramdani, and before that Barry Malone, thank you both for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing.